Yeah, nice to see everyone. Been a cool couple of days. Hope everyone's doing fine. So I will be doing a talk on the Indian roots of generative music. And when I mean generative music, I mean all sorts of things like live coding, algorithmic compositions, little bit, but a little bit about me first. So my name is George. I'm in the final year of my design degree at Shrishti, and that's where I. Huh? Huh? Yeah. So. No, I don't know. Is it sharing? I think it's moving. No, it's. I think it's stuck. Okay. Yeah. So sorry about that small hassle. So my name is George. I'm still a student at Shrishti, Bangalore, where I'm doing my final year in industrial design. At Shrishti, I had the opportunity to really deeply explore the world of new media, creative tech, computational design. Lovely 4 years, honestly. In my third year, I spent a year with Yashash Shetty at the Indian Sonic Research Organization, where I worked with sound artists from, you have the Zurich University of Arts, a couple of them from NYU. And during my residency there, I was working with neurotechnology and specifically brain-computer interfaces. Now, like after that, I kind of like work with a couple of different things. I like to make new media art. I try to look into like generative geometry now, computational geometry. Part-time, I work as a haptic design technologist for Composable Umwelten, where we try to make things like haptic compositions. Trivik's doing really cool stuff at the company. So if anyone's interested in neurohaptics or neurotechnology, please check them out. But let's move on. It's an open-ended question I'd like everyone to ponder over, because that's a question I've really come across over the past 2 years of both academic and independent research. That is there really like a validity to taking an Indian approach as opposed to like a Western one? Because we're all familiar with 12-tone systems, you're all familiar with bar sheets, 4x4 signature time. But does that work? Or could we try something else? Because it's Music Tech India, it's not ADC Korea or France. So why not try, if you're sitting on a bedrock of knowledge, why not try an alternative approach? So that's what I want to do with this presentation today. It's to hopefully build a somewhat valid argument, but I'll let you guys answer that question hopefully after the entire presentation. Couple of disclaimers. This became a much bigger topic than I anticipated. So these are like tiny rabbit holes I'll be presenting here, but the actual topic could be potentially way more vast than I expected. So feel free to check out my work later. I will update quite a bit. So let's go. The first thing I want to talk about as the bedrock of music is time. So when you look at like Western and Eastern cultures, our topic of time, like our understanding of time is actually very different. So usually, I think many of us are familiar with the one in the West, like on the left, which is like a standard time signature on a musical sheet. And the thing with a lot of Western time signatures or how the West thinks about time is very linear. Like you move from point A to point B. And that makes sense with how they conceptualize music. But when we look at like Eastern concepts like in raga or in Chinese timing examples as well, it works as a principle of generative cycles where the musician kind of bounces across the entire framework. And that allows for some very interesting possibilities when you think about it in terms of computer music or like sequencing. So a couple of you have used VCV rack, I assume, or some of us use maybe Super Collider or Sonic Pi. And like the Tala system, you keep returning back to the same initial note like a cycle. So that allows a lot of like generative possibilities. And it's interesting why we don't think about it in this term, in this sense, because we already have people do this in things like tidal cycles, where you still have the same cyclic rhythm that people kind of return to, and it reincarnates like a wave. If you've seen the Domyun performances in Tokyo, you see like artists like maybe Atsushi Tadokoro. He also uses tidal cycles, and he implements actual tablas and konakols in that, and he really makes use of that cyclic rhythm. When you see Indian artists like Koparzi talk about like tidal, it really changes the way they think about music. But that's already inherent to the Tala system, or how traditional musicians always talked about Indian music. So that is one way to think about computer music and Indian music as well. One sec, I'll just get up this photo. But yeah. Even including improvisation, you see people do things with jazz on things like Bespoke, where they computationally improvise and you have other instruments react to it. So I think like improvisation and cyclicity is a very important part of computer music and Indian music. And that's one interesting thread. Let's move on to the next. Now, this is my favorite because I know I talk about neurotechnology, but long term, I'd like to work with spatial audio and immersion. But the origins of the universe in a lot of like Indian philosophy would mostly be something called the Shabda, which is this initial primordial sound that architecturally or like morphogenetically creates the universe spatially. So they don't think of it in terms of like stereo, they think of it in terms of 3D space. And that has a lot to do with like the metaphysics or cosmology of ancient India, where they think like it's like a base ground where things emerge from. You see that happen in instruments such as the tanpura, or you have an ambient drone string in the sitar, which creates this background spatial noise, and then the melody emerges from that. And what's interesting with where some of us like work with things like music for healthcare and music for mental health, is that this idea that drawing people into a phonosphere or a soundscape, especially a 3D soundscape, can actually create the sense of the sublime. Now, the sublime is kind of different from the sense of beauty. When you think of beauty, it's something like, oh, it's something pretty. But sublime is something like if you see a huge valley, you see that sense of like space. Or maybe if you look at the night sky, that sense of immense boundaries kind of makes you look at it with a sense of awe. And that kind of tends to dissolve your ego. And that's what the ancient Indian musicians try to do with their instruments. Now, Maslow, before he died, like a couple of years before his death, he actually postulated that self-transcendence itself was a need to be fulfilled. And that is something that Indian musicians also thought about. If you look at like ancient aestheticians like Bharata, who wrote like the Natya Shastra, the first Indian book on music and aesthetics and stuff, that was what he wanted to do. So you take people into the simulation and then you try to dissolve their ego. Let's look at something like, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Las Vegas sphere. And that huge sphere, you have a lot of displays and stuff. And one interesting thing when you look at social media reactions to this is that a lot of the visitors said this was something like a very spiritual experience. Not just with the Las Vegas sphere, you see that happen with a lot of immersive media. It's kind of like, oh, where am I? And what is this? So yeah, I think this has a lot of potential when you look at the Metasounds engine or like spatial audio in like Unreal Engine. You can create these very powerful ambient soundscapes combined with a visual feedback. I think there is something very powerful to be evoked here. So that's interesting. Let's go to the next one. Discovery. So discovery is also a very interesting thing. So I'm going to take you through something called byte beats. So byte beats are kind of like the lowest level of live coding, where people actually write these wave equations and describe like a calculation, and that actually creates a sound. But byte beats are not created. The people who make them say they discovered them in the space of the computer, and no one really knew it was possible to like write tiny C programs and then make entire sounds out of a one-line program. And it was actually created, or like discovered, I would say, by this guy named Wisnut in the early days of the demo scene. And this is how he described coming across byte beats. And no one really expected it. It kind of sent shockwaves throughout the entire demo scene community that such a thing could happen. Very interestingly, ragas are also said to be described the same way. So people do not, like Indian artists, they don't create ragas or they don't write or calculate ragas, they discover them. And you could have an infinite amount of ragas possible, and you actually have musicians build or discover their own ragas. Why is this the case? I am not completely sure, but it has something to do with the way they conceive the universe as this like combinatorial space of possibilities, like kind of like hyperspace or a higher dimension of things where you can draw inspiration from. I think when you think about things like latent space in AI music or the new stuff with stability audio, something interesting to think of there. So yeah. Sorry. This is one of the most favorite things I've come across. So Irv Wilson was this guy who studied something called Zen harmonics, which is like, how do you think of tuning systems outside of standard 12-tone systems? Like, so you have C, D, E, F, G, C. That's the standard 12-tone system of most Western music. He tried to create alternate tuning systems, which means alternate music systems. So Indian music uses one tuning system, Chinese music uses one tuning system. So this guy tried to create stuff that actually generates tuning systems. And he actually did this a lot later in his life. But in his early life, he used to read like entire papers on Carnatic music. If you look at his website, you see all these papers written on South Indian ragas and South Indian Carnatic music. So this diagram you see here is actually the actual calculation format where he takes a base frequency and then he kind of generates the entire tuning system from one single frequency. So like 400 hertz, he then builds the entire tuning system. And this is actually a 2D representation of a 3D sculpture of a 4D scale. So I find it very interesting how he really took the soul of discovery from Indian music and then built this entire corpus. If you're interested in what he did with tuning systems, there's a documentary called Surfing the Sonic Sky. I think it's also a website. Really cool stuff out there. So bonus stuff. This is just like not really like principles you can take off, but something interesting maybe you could dig into it deeper. So Pingala, who is kind of like rumored to be the brother of the grammarian Panini, I think a couple of you are familiar with him. So he actually created this like binary syllable-based generative rhythm system for poetry. And he actually used like Fibonacci sequences when he created these rhythms. So I think there's something interesting there as well. It's very interesting to see how a lot of theorists took very computational or computational analogous approaches when they thought about music and rhythms and stuff. This I found kind of funny. So on the leftmost, you can see one of those very dubious Facebook posts where you see like ancient India, like high-profile signs and stuff. I later saw a touch designer video that like actually lets you create this kind of like architectural music or architectural like waveform patterns. So if you're thinking of things like in VR, maybe you can actually create sonic temples or real archi music. And I think that's something you can actually do with a degree of serious intent. The third one's an actual example of archi music. So in certain places like the Vitala temple in Hampi or in the Velayappa temple in Tamil Nadu, you actually have these pillars. They're called Ranga Mandapas, but these pillars actually are said to be musical. And when you tap them, you can actually hear a musical note. So we don't know how they did it, but it seems that when you talk about ancient India, they really took the principle of architecture and archi music very seriously. So finally, the stuff I'm doing right now, I think with more obscure languages like Uterpi, you kind of can do things like self-similar melodies, which is like fractals. Fractals are something you see pop up in a lot of Indian art and Indian music. Kind of because like the ancient Indians kind of thought of holonomics or holography, where everything is a self-similar replication of God at some level. So you can also do this in Super Collider. Super Collider also has some like L system-based fractal music generators. So you see a lot of potential there. I think that's it for now. Hope this has been somewhat convincing because I think there's a lot more to do out there. I think like there's some stuff in tantric art as well where you have like geometricals. That's something I'm doing on my own, but you can look into audio visuals and stuff. There's a lot of work to be done in like audio visuals when you talk about Indian music. So yeah, questions? Anyone?
Hey, this was super interesting. I had a question. You mentioned Tidal and like tools,
Yeah,
tools like that. So there are tons of generative music tools out there. So in your research, what have you seen is like are missing components in these to be able to create Indian-oriented like generative music?
So a lot of so very interestingly, you can see like kind of like Easter eggs of Indian music in a lot of generative systems. So if you use Sonic Pi, you will see a tuning scale of Purvi or Bhairavi. If you use VCV, I'm sure a lot of you use. There's one sequencer. There's a macro oscillator, or if you, I don't know which one is it, the random sampler that everyone uses. I think that's also called Tidal in VCV. But you can actually create Bhairavi generatively in VCV there. I think in Unreal Engine's meta sounds, you can kind of use Bhaskara's sine tone formula to create music there. But the problem is it's all very dispersed. So you have like one idea here, one idea there. It's not in one system, right? And people can't make up their minds. So you have a lot of like Western researchers take one idea here and they think of it very interestingly. But I think if you're trying to think of something like completely indigenous, it requires a lot of intent. So maybe if we kind of integrate all these concepts into one platform or one system, that would be, in my opinion, truly indigenous. If you ask me if there's anything out there that really replicates indigenous systems, I don't think it exists.
Well, in Tidal you can make your own scales and stuff, so
Yeah.
you can make your own tuning systems on the fly. So that works.
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah, even there's this app called Wilsonic where you can build your own tuning systems, but it's not really the actual, like, not to the degree that Wilson himself did it. So
Yeah, I mean, you can also take the Scala archive,
yeah,
pull out things from there, stick it in.
there's a lot you can do with all these concepts. I mean, I hope this is just what I found over like 1 year. I'm pretty sure there's a whole lot more out there which we don't even know exists. So.
Yeah, so I mean, like these little pockets of information exist. You just have to put them together. It's not, integrated into one thing already. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But the tools are out there. Is all I can tell you.
Hi. Really informative presentation. So I just want to know one thing. Like when you were talking about Indian rhythm,
Yeah.
tal, I can sort of imagine a generative possibility in that making music because it's a cycle. It doesn't change. It goes on forever. Whereas when it comes to rag, whatever I've seen while making music, it's generally like just like how he said, make your own scale. But rag is not exactly a scale. It's got specific characteristics like vadi, samvadi, certain weight on certain notes, or even the way you move. It's not, you don't play the whole scale. You move in specific style of the rag,
Yeah.
which could have same notes in another rag, but that is again different the way they approach it. That's the reason why classical musicians spend decades understanding the whole quality of the rag. So, did you find anything moving in that direction in your research, or?
I think like if you try to directly, so the one big problem with Indian art and Indian music is it's kind of fused with the religious nature of worship. So that is kind of a very spicy topic as someone who's not from that community. How do you manage or navigate that? But The thing is, Indian music is a very, what you said about rag is exactly correct. People try to think of rag as a scale. Even when you try to learn Indian music in Bangalore, they try to conceptualize it as a sarigama patanisa on that same Western notation, but there is no analog to rag, or like, rag is not an analog scale, it's its very own thing. That is something I would like to actually fully explore, because I think I believe there's validity to that. One interesting thing about rag is rag actually means to color. So it actually means color. So the entire intent of a rag is to color your mind or to create a sensation of color. So they didn't think of it as just sound. It was a very multimodal way of thinking about music. So I think that, again, it's a huge topic. It's not something you can uncover in a year or two. Probably decades worth of real intentional research has to be put in.
So that is somewhat, it gives you a language to speak in. In Tidal, you can set up these Markov chains where you are only giving certain symbols, and then it completes phrases based on those symbols, sort of a thing, which is kind of what the idea is, that, okay, move in this direction, and then move in this direction after that, because that's what makes sense. That's the aesthetic of it, or that's the language of it is.
I also think it's important to not take it stick to the syllabus. I think we've all been taught as kids to stick to the syllabus a little too much, and to be creative, or if you want to think of something cool, you kind of have to step out of the line a bit. So you can't just follow it by the book and expect to create, because then we'll be stuck in that loop of creating religious music, and it won't be something that moves beyond. A lot of people, when I ask them, why do you not listen to Indian music? It's beautiful. It's beautiful music, but it's frozen in time. And I think it's time we unfreeze it and move forward with something more interesting. Yeah, it's not my opinion. I think it's something that's eternal. But I'm talking about 20-year-olds or 21-year-olds. They're not. Yeah, true. I completely agree. But again, you can't argue with the public, right?
I mean, it's the same thing with jazz.
Yeah, exactly. I would argue for it. I 100% am willing to die on that hill. But then you have to also think. I'm just saying we have to think of it. We can't just be sticking to tradition too much, a bit. That's what I think. That's just my opinion.
Hey, thanks for the interesting presentation. Here.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I just had one question. So you briefly mentioned about music for healthcare, right? So
Yeah.
I right now work in the healthcare industry as a project manager. I do have an interest in these kind of areas where, music, audio, tech.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to know from you, from your experience, what are the different possibilities out there? What are the researches that are happening in that space, audio?
I may not be the best person to talk about music for healthcare, but I think Nimans is doing a lot of cool stuff in their music cognition lab. So right now in the head office at Bangalore, there is a research group that looks at the perceptive or cognitive aspects of music. I don't think it's necessarily Indian music, but then 2 weeks ago, they wanted tabla players to test out stuff for their experiments. So I think they're doing really cool stuff. So you should probably reach out to the music cognition lab. When you talk about music in healthcare, again, it's not something a lot of us are familiar with, but it's an idea taken very seriously as in research abroad. Like how you look at the cybernetics of, especially with things like EEG and stuff with brain-computer interfaces. So you can kind of auto-regulate your own mood-based systems based on visual feedback or audio feedback. So I think when you look at EEG or biosignals and music, something to explore there. I'm not the best person to ask on this. I'll ask her about this.
Thanks.
Hello.
I think there's one more. Yeah.
Hi, I really liked your talk. So I'm Madhumita, and I also learn Carnatic music, and I do give concerts. And I have some experience in AI. I didn't know about Markov models and how you could use that to kind of generate scales and stick to the scale, but I do agree that a raga is more than a scale. So
Yeah.
what is your opinion about generative Indian music? And like you said, I think the music that we have right now in Carnatic is very close to religion. It is tied up to religion. So maybe having generative Indian compositions on different themes, but in the style of Carnatic music, is probably something that would like draw in the youth. But what are some challenges that you feel exist in creating?
I think challenges, again, so you probably have way more experience with Carnatic music than I do since you are trained. I think the major challenge is just thinking. So I don't know why these things, like these facts, are so explicitly put out there. It's easy for everyone to access, and yet did no one think that there was something there? Why did it take time? Or why don't people have faith? I think it's a question of thinking more than, because challenges can be overcome. We have brilliant people in this country. So I don't buy it that whatever technical challenge that is there, I think that can be bypassed. But if you keep looking at the West, or if you keep looking at what's happening outside India, I think that perception that we have nothing to do with what the knowledge we have is something that has to be overcome. Ragas itself, again, I think ragas are way more flexible than a lot of other systems, especially like with the gamakas, you can kind of like not fiddle around with it. Again, I don't want to like touch it too much as a non-expert.
So you think that we can have generative music,
Yes,
but with some kind of constraints?
Absolutely, I think there's potential for generative music, and I think people are already doing that. There are artists who work with generative ragas that I've seen in the country, and people who do live coding and in NYC and stuff, they take this stuff very seriously. So there is potential. It's just about taking initiative or maybe a leap of faith, I think.
Thank you.
There was a performance yesterday by Jagannath. He calls himself Jackbot at Shunya yesterday. And he basically demonstrated how you can have all the gamakas, all the right motions and all of that. Of course, you need to know what the aesthetic is. You need to know what the language is. And of course, your tool. So look up this guy, and look up this tool also called Din is Noise. Pretty cool things in there.
That's wonderful. It's wonderful to hear that people are doing stuff like that. So yeah. So. Thank you so much.